This is quite a tricky one, isn't it, about advice? I'm never sure about the word advice. I suppose it comes from that being a social worker, you don't want to give advice to people, or you don't want to, and it kind of sets you up in a way. What advice would you give? Because we can all give advice. I suppose, though, the thing is, I have been a social worker for 31 years. I've been working on reflective practice, writing about it, training on it for more than 20 years. So maybe there is something that I can offer from that experience. But what's really difficult is I would actually give different people different advice. I think it almost needs to be, if you are giving advice and using that word, it needs to be tailored, doesn't it, to that individual and the circumstance that they're in. But maybe you would need to work through questions like some of the questions we've asked today. And I'm just thinking this now as we've come to this final question, but it's almost think about those questions for yourself. What does reflective practice mean to you? Why is reflective practice important to you? What are the barriers for you? And then it comes out with your, if you like, your unique framework for reflection. And then you could look for unique advice based around that. So I'd give everybody different advice, but maybe there's some key things that I'd say, and I've probably already said them in the conversation, to be honest, but one is be kind to yourself. Don't use reflective practice in a way to beat yourself up. That's important. Yes, there are always things we can learn, and yes, we do need to be open to learning and to change, but we also need to be kind to ourselves and think about what we've done well. So I suppose that's one piece. And if you're a manager, the advice is don't always keep asking people, what will you do differently? Also say to them, give them feedback and say, that was a great piece of work and you could maybe use this. What could you use from this that you could use again? So that kindness, I think, is really important. I think being open to creative approaches really matters. So an experience that I had recently, not within the project, but where I met with a group of like senior social workers and gave them a technique that I said, this could be a really good technique for you to use in groups. And they, if I'm honest with you, at the end of the session, our agreement was I'd give them a technique, they'd go and use it, and then we'd come back again in a month's time or so and talk and have another technique. And they would, so it was really to encourage them to go away and sort of do reflective conversations. And I did this technique with them and they were like, oh no, people won't like that. No, people won't like that. To be fair to them, they gave it a go. And then the following month they came back and they went, I am amazed. It went brilliant. People loved it, and I think what's really important is they were very open. They were skeptical at first, but then they used it. They didn't let that skepticism hold them back. They did use it. And I think that was a key learning moment for them, that here's something I don't think will work, but actually it did work really well. So I suppose it's about being open, especially as a supervisor. If you hear a technique and you think, oh no, that doesn't really work for me, it doesn't encourage me to be reflective, or even I tried it with that worker and it didn't work for them. Different things work for different people. So be open to trying out different things. And as a worker, be open into testing out an idea and don't think, oh no, that won't help me to reflect. Be open. And the more open you are, the more you'll get from it. So I think it's about just openness matters. And maybe in a way, I don't know if it's the wrong word, but we're working in children and families here, but playfulness almost, be willing to be playful with reflection. We know how helpful play is for children and how play really enhances learning and development for children, and it shouldn't really be much different for us as adults. Creativity and play and fun helps our learning. So be open to playing around with ideas on reflection and making your own reflective model and testing out silly techniques, but giving just everything a go. Be open and give everything a go. I suppose they're the two main things that for me could be advice to everybody. But then other things, there might be one person listening might think, oh, I really want to give you this advice or this advice because I think this would really work for you. I remember years ago working with a student who was brilliant in practice but wasn't great at reflective writing, and we did quite a lot of work about using different models, and she swapped from using a particular model in her reflective writing to another model, and her grades went up like 20% or something. I'm not guaranteeing that's going to happen for everybody, but unique advice, tailored. So just really being open to your you developing your individual tools and having an individual toolkit for reflection, I suppose, and that would be different for everybody. So maybe that's my advice. It doesn't really make any sense to say I'd give everybody individual advice, but that's I suppose it's that individuality of reflection.
Yeah.
What would your advice be?
Yeah, it's like you say, I'm not sure advice is maybe the best thing, but in terms of, I suppose, what I've learned as a worker and across the project, I really like what you said about that concept of the toolkit, because I think we use that and we understand that as social workers that we can dip in and out of different things. And I suppose it's around not being afraid of trying different things. So you were saying about being open to new things, and I think sometimes we can be our own worst enemy because we might be just a bit scared of getting it wrong. And I think with reflection, it isn't right or wrong in a sense because it's so individual and unique, like you were saying. So don't be scared that you might say the wrong thing or you might think the wrong thing, because it comes back to you and your feelings and your experience. And only through exploring that and developing those skills are you going to become more self-aware. And become better at it, I suppose. So yeah, definitely don't be afraid to try new things and don't be afraid to get it wrong, because there isn't really a right or wrong in reflection. And I suppose the other thing, what we've spoken about today that really stood out for me was about remember that link between reflection and self-care, because we know that reflection can help mitigate some of that stress. So whether that is through group reflection, supervision, a critical friend, reflective writing, a journal, whatever it may be, it's going to help you in some way. So I would kind of hang on to that in my own mind.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, actually. I liked the way as well where you summarised that all the different tools that we can use, like reflective writing, critical friendship, group reflection, reflection in supervision, that transitional moment reflection. There's so many different spaces, aren't there, really, for reflection? So I really like that advice. So here's an example of modelling the model, and we weren't planning on doing this at all, Wendy, but when you mentioned earlier that you really like the surprises to learning method, it comes from that, I don't know if you know, but it comes from the collaborative model of direct observation, which was developed years ago. I think it was 2000 actually, and it was a model of directly observing students that was developed at the University of York. And as part of that model, they suggested that you concluded everything after you've done the direct observation, you've given the feedback and everything, that you conclude the whole thing with those 4 headings: surprises, satisfactions, dissatisfactions, and learning. And over the years, I found those 4 are so good to just conclude any activity in a reflective way. So when you said it earlier, I was thinking, well, of course, because that offers, that particular method really offers a great conclusion to reflection. So maybe we should conclude our conversation using that. So we haven't prepared for this at all, but let's just go ahead and model the model. And each of us can share, based on our reflective conversation today, our surprises, satisfactions, dissatisfactions, and learning, and we'll see where we go. So I would say my surprise, that the first thing that comes to my head when I think about surprises and the conversation that we've had today is we've had so many conversations about the project and about supporting reflection within the project and how that can be done. And I've really enjoyed working with you because you've been really open to new ideas. We've had all those conversations. But what's really struck me today is the structure of these 10 questions that you had the questions, and then we just said we'll have a conversation about those questions. I've learned so much more from you listening to it, because maybe the structured conversation of here are the questions, because previously when we've met, our conversations have almost not had a structure, and sometimes they've gone off in different directions, which in some ways has been helpful because it's been creative and open and, oh, what about this idea? What about that idea? But maybe today, because we've had a structure, I don't know, I've maybe just sat and listened more. I've not been thinking about what do I want to say. I've really truly listened to what you've been saying. I don't know, but I feel like I've learned so much more about what's been helpful in the project just from listening to your answers to the questions. And that's been a surprise, because we've met so many times before, had so many conversations before, but maybe the 10 questions, maybe that would be a really good thing to do for supervision, or a reflective conversation with a critical friend. Maybe it's a good method. Here's maybe not 10 questions, but here's 3 questions that we're going to have a conversation about. And it's not just a one way, it's a both people answering the same question. I don't know, it's worked really well because I've learned a lot about the project. So that's my surprise. What about your surprise today then?
I suppose it's how you can condense so much information, I think, into such short answers. Because I think reflection, really, we could have sat all day and spoken about all these different questions, what it brings to mind, what it means, and we could have delved into a lot of things, I think. So I think having that structure, like you were saying, it's surprising that you can kind of condense it down but still have those kind of key important messages.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so satisfactions then. I suppose I've had a few satisfactions. Some of them are very practical, and they're almost immediate satisfactions that may not work later. Because one of the satisfactions is it seems to have recorded okay, but when I come to watching it back, that might not be a satisfaction because maybe it hasn't recorded all right, you know. So I think some of that shows the difference between surface and deeper. It might be an immediate satisfaction, but maybe later it's not, when we see what the actual video turns out like. So, but I'm thinking, oh, it's gone smoothly, we've got it done, you know. So I suppose that's a satisfaction, but is it a long-term one? Maybe one of the big satisfactions is, I think, although we didn't write it like this, the questions actually seem to have led one into another. So there seems to have been almost a connection in the conversation. So even though it's had these questions, that the conversation seems to have flowed actually from my perspective. So I think that's a satisfaction. Yeah. What about your satisfactions?
So I think because we've had that time, like you say, to take a step back and unpick the different things, I think it's a satisfaction for me to kind of feel that sense of achievement of what's been done through the project and this work that we've been doing with yourself. So it's really satisfying to feel like we've offered different things to workers that hopefully it is having an impact on practice. So just thinking about the different approaches we've used, the different things we've brought in, the different people we've connected with, that yeah, hopefully it's going to have a positive impact on yes, children and families and individuals that we work with, really.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just wondering whether that begins to create my dissatisfaction. I don't know if that sounds right, really, but I think one of the things I'm always dissatisfied with around reflection is the use of models that don't come from social work. You know, the most commonly taught models come largely from health or education backgrounds. And I feel like, you know, social work and reflection are so connected and intrinsically linked. And sometimes I really get quite frustrated about why aren't we using more models developed by social workers? And I suppose in a way that is a bit of a dissatisfaction, is that, you know, the work that you've been doing within the project, and of course the reflective element of the project is one tiny part of the whole project. You know, the project's been very significant in terms of looking at social work with children and families across the area. And so it's only one aspect, but maybe a dissatisfaction is, I think the more that I've learned about what you've been doing in the project, it's enhanced my learning and my understanding. And I wonder whether there's so much really good work being done by social workers all over the UK, and those pockets of practice, who's picking those up? Who's sharing those? Who's, you know, I'd love to have another conversation with you that is just literally highlighting, look, these are the key parts of the project that we've done that other people can watch, and it becomes shared outside of your own area. So maybe that's a dissatisfaction, that I think there's so much excellent practice that social workers do, but I suppose much like the issues earlier, we keep focused so much on what isn't going well. Are we really sharing that fabulous stuff that is going really well in social work? And so maybe that's my dissatisfaction. We're not sharing it enough with one another, and we'd learn such a lot from listening to one another. I think that's my dissatisfaction. What about your dissatisfaction?
So I think on reflection and thinking about all the things that we've discussed throughout this conversation, I suppose my dissatisfaction is the frustration that I know as a practitioner how important reflective practice is. And all our discussions today have highlighted some of the key points, some things to take away, some practical things. But how easy is that to do in practice becomes that going back to the barriers and things, just thinking about, do we give enough time to it, and do we allow ourselves that time really? So the dissatisfaction for me is knowing the importance, but giving it the time that it deserves. And it's just so difficult to do as a social worker, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And all those barriers that are in place. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so then we've got learning, and I always think it's interesting when you use this method, because it's not a specific question, is it? It's not like, you don't say, well, what was your surprise today, or what was your learning today? It's just learning. And so I conclude supervision sessions using this method. I think I've told you that before, but very often I'll get to learning, and sometimes people will tell me about the key thing they've learned, or they'll tell me something about their learning environment. So it can be a whole range of different things. And I think when I've used this method for myself, I've almost always gone with learning being what I've learned in that session. So I use it sometimes when I'm doing a reflective account for the regulator, and I usually conclude my reflective account with surprises, satisfactions, dissatisfactions, learning. And nearly always learning is about what I've learned. But actually today my thinking around learning is a bit different. What I've been thinking is, I think this conversation has been, I've learned a lot from it. I think I said that in my surprise about how much I've learned that I didn't kind of know before. But I also think that maybe listening to conversations is a key learning tool for students and new workers. I mean, we know that anyway, don't we? I know that, if you're in a really busy office and you're new to a role, even not as a student, even as an experienced worker, but you're new to a role, you overhear conversations and you think, oh, I like the way they did that, I'll try that. Or I like, so listening into conversations can be a real helpful learning tool. But I'm wondering about whether in this online world, how can we replicate those conversations for people to overhear? And maybe what we've done today is replicated a conversation about reflection for people to overhear. And I wonder if we could do a bit more of that to enhance learning. So I'm thinking about, I've just thought this is a really good learning tool, I suppose.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
What about your learning?
I think one of the main things that struck me, and I think is really useful, is what you said about a reflective model being kind of multi-purpose, that it doesn't have to be just for you to use to reflect on a situation, that it can be used as a direct work tool with an individual. So that I feel like there's learning from that for me, that I want to go away and I want to have a look at all the models again, because I might see them in a different light. So I'm excited and intrigued to go and have a look and see, actually, would I use that with a family or an individual or a child, and kind of see what I take from that, I suppose.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I suppose that just also concludes things in, I think, how much we learn from students as practice educators, because I've seen students using reflective tools and things that I've used with them in supervision, I've seen them then use with families, and I've realised how much that can be useful. So I think we learn a lot from one another, don't we?
Yeah, definitely.